Every single day, roughly 17 million barrels of oil move through a stretch of water so narrow you could cross it in a commercial flight in under 4 minutes. The Strait of Hormuz. At its tightest point, the navigable shipping lane is only 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 miles. That is the margin between the global economy functioning and the global economy seizing up. The numbers are almost impossible to process. 1 in every 4 barrels of oil traded on Earth passes through this strait. Nearly a third of all liquefied natural gas exports flow through the same choke point. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, all of them depend on this water to sell their oil to the world. Japan imports nearly 90% of its crude through Hormuz. South Korea, India, China, same story. If this strait closes for a week, fuel prices spike on every continent. If it closes for a month, the ripple effects reach grocery stores, airlines, manufacturing plants, and military operations from Washington to Warsaw. There is no serious alternative. The east-west pipeline across Saudi Arabia can handle some overflow, but nowhere near enough. The other routes are longer, slower, and far more expensive. Hormuz is not just important. It is, in practical terms, irreplaceable. And Iran sits on the northern shore of every mile of it. That geography is not an accident of history that Tehran quietly accepts. It is the central fact around which Iranian strategic thinking has been built for decades. Iranian leaders have said it plainly, repeatedly, and in public. If Iran is pressured, sanctioned, or threatened, the strait becomes a tool, a lever, a weapon that does not require a warhead. Revolutionary Guard patrols these waters with fast boats, submarines, and shore-based missile batteries positioned along the coastline. Iran has practiced, in military exercises that the whole world has watched, exactly how it would shut the strait down. Mines, swarm tactics, anti-ship missiles fired from land. The drills are not subtle, they are messages. For years, the Western response was to treat Iranian threats over Hormuz as bluster. Dangerous talk from a regime that knew closing the strait would hurt itself as much as anyone else. That calculation is now being tested. Because Iran is not just threatening the strait anymore, it is building the institutional architecture to control it, permanently. In the spring of 2023, Iran announced the formation of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. On the surface, the name sounds bureaucratic, administrative, the kind of thing that gets a paragraph in a trade journal and disappears. But the people paying close attention, naval analysts, Gulf state ministries, officials in Washington, understood immediately what it was. This was not a maritime safety office. It was a claim. The authority was established under the direct oversight of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy. Not the conventional Iranian Navy, which operates under the regular military chain of command, but the Revolutionary Guard, the ideological armed force that answers to the supreme leader. The Revolutionary Guard has spent decades conducting asymmetric operations across the region. That choice of institutional parent was deliberate. It told you exactly what kind of authority this was meant to be. The stated mandate of the new body covers vessel monitoring, transit coordination, and what Iranian officials describe as ensuring the security of navigation in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. In theory, that sounds like Coast Guard work. In practice, it means that Iran has created a formal governmental structure with the explicit mission of managing who moves through the strait and under what conditions. It is the bureaucratic foundation for something far larger than bureaucracy. To understand why this matters, consider what legitimacy does over time. When a country sets up an authority, gives it a name, assigns it staff, issues regulations under its banner, and enforces those regulations consistently enough that other parties start responding to them, that authority begins to acquire a kind of weight. Not legal weight necessarily, but operational weight, behavioral weight, the weight of repeated fact. Iran has watched how other powers use institutional architecture to solidify territorial claims. It has watched how presence, persistence, and paperwork can shift the baseline of what the world accepts as normal. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority is that strategy applied to the most valuable waterway on the planet. Iranian state media framed the announcement in the language of sovereignty and regional order. Foreign forces, the messaging went, are the source of instability in these waters. Iran, as a coastal state with centuries of presence in the Gulf, is the natural guarantor of safe passage. The authority in this framing is not aggression. It is responsibility. That framing is worth remembering, because it is exactly the argument Iran intends to make in every confrontation that follows. The legal battle over the Strait of Hormuz has been running in parallel with the military one for decades, and it is in some ways the more dangerous fight. Guns and boats create incidents. Legal arguments, repeated long enough, create reality. The foundation of international maritime law on this question is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, signed in 1982. Under that framework, the Strait of Hormuz qualifies as a strait used for international navigation, which means all ships, including warships, enjoy what the convention calls transit passage. That right is continuous, expeditious, and non-suspendable. No coastal state can block it, condition it, or require advance permission for it. The law is explicit. Iran signed the convention. Iran has also spent 40 years arguing that it does not apply the way everyone else thinks it does. Iran's position rests on two lines of argument. The first is that foreign warships, particularly American naval vessels, require prior notification before entering Iranian territorial waters within the strait. This is not a fringe interpretation. Iran has codified it in domestic legislation and repeated it in diplomatic channels. The second argument goes further, that the transit passage regime itself was designed by and for Western naval powers, and that regional states have the sovereign right to define the terms of passage through waters that border their territory. Both arguments are rejected by the United States, the European Union, and the majority of maritime nations. But rejection and enforcement are two different things. What Iran has done, systematically and patiently, is act on its own interpretation regardless of what the international consensus says. Iranian naval vessels have approached foreign warships in the strait to demand identification and state of mission. Iranian officials have issued statements treating certain transits as violations of Iranian sovereignty. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority now provides an institutional mechanism to formalize exactly these kinds of challenges, to issue regulations, log violations, and build a paper record that Iran can point to as evidence of an established practice. This is how customary international law works, and Iran understands it perfectly. Customary law is built from state practice and the belief that the practice is legally required. If Iran acts consistently enough on its interpretation, and if other states respond in ways that implicitly acknowledge Iranian authority, by negotiating, by rerouting, by quietly complying, then Iran's position gains legal texture over time. The strait has not changed, but the rules governing it are slowly being rewritten from the northern shore. Legal arguments move slowly, gunboats move fast, and Iran has made sure that the legal campaign never runs without a kinetic one running alongside it. The record of Iranian seizures, harassment, and interdictions in the strait and the broader Gulf is long enough now that individual incidents risk blurring together. That blurring is itself a problem, because each incident was a calculated move, not a random provocation. Together, they form a pattern that tells you exactly what Iran is doing and exactly how much it believes it can get away with. April of 2019, Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats approached a Marshall Islands flagged tanker in the strait and ordered it to change course toward Iranian waters. The tanker was escorted away by a U.S. Navy vessel before the seizure could be completed. 3 months later, Iran seized the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero in the Strait of Hormuz, holding the ship and its crew for more than 2 months. Iranian officials described it as a response to the British detention of an Iranian tanker near Gibraltar. The message was symmetrical and deliberate. We can reach your ships too. In 2021, An Iranian-linked attack on the Israeli-managed tanker Mercer Street killed 2 crew members off the coast of Oman. In 2023, Iranian forces seized 2 tankers within days of each other, the Advantage Suite and the Niovi, both in international waters, both taken to Iranian ports. In early 2024, the pattern continued with further interdictions that drew brief headlines and produced no lasting consequences for Tehran. Each of these incidents followed a structure. Iran acted. The international community protested. Diplomatic notes were filed. In some cases, crews were eventually released after weeks or months of quiet negotiation. The ships moved on, and Iran absorbed the lesson that the cost of seizure was manageable. What makes this more than routine aggression is the relationship between the seizures and the legal framework Iran is building around them. When Iran takes a tanker, it issues a legal justification: violations of maritime regulations, environmental infractions, unpaid debts. The justifications are often transparently pretextual, but they exist. They are filed with Iranian courts. They are announced by Iranian officials. They feed the narrative that Iran is not a pirate state acting outside the law, but a sovereign authority enforcing it. That distinction matters enormously. Pirates can be hunted. Authorities have to be negotiated with. The United States has maintained a naval presence in the Persian Gulf continuously since 1949. The Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American carriers have transited the strait hundreds of times. Washington's official position has never wavered. The Strait of Hormuz is an international waterway, transit passage is a right, and the United States will defend that right by force if necessary. And yet Iran keeps seizing tankers. The gap between that stated position and that operational reality is where the story gets uncomfortable. The problem is not American will. It is American bandwidth. The U.S. Navy is stretched across the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea simultaneously. Escorting every commercial tanker through the strait is not a realistic option. Operation Prosperity Guardian, launched in late 2023 to counter Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, illustrated exactly this tension. Protecting one choke point pulls resources away from another. Iran watches these constraints as carefully as any intelligence service watches an adversary's order of battle. The Gulf states themselves present a more complicated picture. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have every reason to oppose Iranian dominance of the strait. Their oil revenues depend on it. Both countries have invested heavily in their own naval capabilities and have quietly deepened security cooperation with the United States. The Abraham Accords opened new channels of intelligence sharing with Israel, adding another layer of regional coordination that Tehran has to account for. But the Gulf states also have to live next to Iran permanently. The United States can reposition assets. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi cannot relocate. That calculus produces a pattern of public firmness and private caution that Iran has learned to exploit. When Gulf state officials talk about the strait in international forums, the language is strong. When the same officials sit across a table from Iranian counterparts to discuss regional trade or diplomatic normalization, the language softens. The two tracks run simultaneously, and each one slightly undermines the other. Europe's response has been even more limited. The European Maritime Awareness Mission in the Strait operates with modest assets and a mandate focused on monitoring rather than enforcement. It documents Iranian behavior thoroughly. It deters it barely at all. What the collective response has produced so far is a situation where Iran faces real friction, but not real cost. Friction slows a strategy. It does not stop one. The scenario that keeps energy analysts and naval strategists awake at night is not a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz. A full closure would be an act of war so unambiguous that it would almost certainly trigger a military response severe enough to end the Islamic Republic as a governing structure. Iran knows this. It is not the play. The play is something subtler and in many ways more durable. A strait that remains technically open but functionally controlled, where tanker operators quietly factor Iranian approval into their routing decisions. where insurance premiums for non-compliant vessels rise high enough that compliance becomes the rational economic choice, where foreign navies transit but do so with an awareness that they are being monitored, logged, and measured against a set of Iranian regulations that the rest of the world does not recognize but cannot quite ignore, where the Persian Gulf Strait Authority sits at the center of that system, issuing permits, filing violations, and accumulating the institutional weight of a body that has been allowed to function long enough to seem normal. This is not a hypothetical future. It is the direction of travel that the last several years have already established. The infrastructure is being built. The precedents are being set. The international response has been real but insufficient, and time, in this kind of contest, works in favor of the patient side. The consequences of that outcome extend well beyond oil prices. If Iran consolidates meaningful control over Hormuz, it redraws the map of American influence in the Middle East more completely than any single military event has done in a generation. Every Gulf state that has built its security on the assumption of American naval supremacy in these waters would have to recalculate. Every Asian economy that feeds its industry through the strait would face a new and permanent source of leverage held by Tehran. Every future round of nuclear negotiations, sanctions discussions, or regional diplomacy would take place under the shadow of an Iran that controls the valve on a quarter of the world's oil supply. Geography gave Iran this opportunity. Patience, institutional creativity, and the consistent willingness to absorb short-term friction in pursuit of long-term position have brought it closer to realizing it than most Western observers have been willing to admit. The strait is still open. The question is who it is open for and on whose terms. That question is being answered right now, slowly and quietly, in the waters between the Iranian coastline and the rest of the world.